The GPS DairyCAST features the high-value insights of the GPS Dairy Consulting team's trusted advisors and the owners and managers from the elite dairy farms they serve. These conversations deliver on the GPS Dairy Consulting promise to inspire change and grow leaders.
Hello and welcome to the GPS DairyCAST. I'm Peggy Coffeen from the Up-Level Dairy Podcast, serving as your host. And on this GPS DairyCAST, we are coming to you from the 2024 GPS Leaders Forum. And joining me for this episode is GPS team member Jordan Hunt, as well as one of today's featured speakers, Dr. Dale Woerner from Texas Tech. In this conversation, we'll get into the topic of moving forward with opportunities and challenges with beef on dairy. Specifically, you're going to hear about two key areas of interest from Dr. Woerner's research: liver abscesses and red meat yield. Get ready to learn and to grow in this conversation from the GPS Leaders Forum.
Well, thanks, Dale, for joining us at Leaders Forum and being a presenter. To start it off, I was hoping you could give us a high-level overview of your presentation from today.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it feels like we're still working in a new space in beef on dairy, but we're really not. You know, we're several years into this, and our research program at Texas Tech, moving into year 6, working on beef on dairy. In the nature of research is you kind of work to solve problems. Not to be negative, but that's what we focus on. You know, what are the challenges? What are the issues with beef on dairy? And just kind of going back to the very beginning, you know, our first approach at beef on dairy was replacing the traditional straight-bred dairy steer, primarily the Holstein. And early on, it was, man, look how much better these crossbreds are. And the glass was really half full. And then we started to transition and kill hundreds or thousands of these cattle through the packing industry. And it's like, wait a minute, these cattle aren't perfect. They're a lot better than the traditional Holstein in so many ways. But we started to see issues with liver abscesses. We started to see issues with red meat yield and conformation of carcasses. The genetics were just getting going at that time from the beef genetic side of things. Of course, now, you know, we're in high gear and the genetics are as good as they've ever been for that space. So a lot of these things are improving. However, liver abscesses and red meat yield concerns remain, you know, at the top of the list. You don't hear a beef on dairy talk today from anyone really without mentioning liver abscess. And I think that's probably the biggest thing in front of us in this sector of the industry that we still need to really work on to resolve. The red meat yield space, we refer to that as yield grade, of course, on the beef carcass side of things. Yield grade is actually very outdated, antiquated system. It's being replaced, or at least there's work to be done to replace that, to improve that. There's a lot of opportunity there for those raising these crossbred calves to understand what that's going to look like in the future, so they can genetically select these cattle to, you know, fit the build and to make more money. Ultimately, these cattle have improved conformation and muscularity. They've improved holistically. But the management side of things, which really falls out of the dairyman's hands, when I'm talking about management, I'm really talking about the feedlot or the terminal end of the spectrum here, where we're just overfeeding these cattle. And that's not just a beef on dairy issue. That's an issue with our entire beef cattle industry. Our market signals are very much geared towards producing heavier cattle that are producing heavier carcasses and incentivizing what we call dressing percentage. So that's just the conversion of that live animal to carcass. And so that percentage we want to grow. And, you know, these crossbred cattle will dress somewhere between 62% and 63.5% on average nationally. The native cattle, so your Angus types, they'll dress 64 or 64.5. And so these feedlots are pushing further and further towards these heavier weights. Ultimately, it's creating more fat on the outside of the carcasses. And so that's really challenging the red meat yield space, in addition to the fact that the dairy animal's just not naturally heavily muscled. So there's opportunity there with a changing system. Talk a lot today about what that system looks like and the technologies that are going to be used to measure holistically the carcass composition. And so really liver abscesses and this carcass conformation and composition, that's where most of our focus is lying right now, and trying to improve those things moving forward for this sector. Of course, looming in the background is the idea that the beef industry is trying to rebuild numbers. And supply and demand certainly kicks in. If there are a lot more native beef cattle, value generally goes down. And so I think that's something that dairymen and women have to prepare for. These day-olds may not always be worth what they're worth today, but we have to continue to work to make sure that we have them at their full value, right? So that when the beef herd returns, these cattle are still very much a valuable part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. You had mentioned maybe some technology coming down the pipeline to help the industry better categorize like red meat score. Would you mind sharing a little more about that?
So the yield grade equation for beef carcasses utilizes ribeye area as an estimation of muscling. And the ribeye area is quite literally the ribeye steak in the middle of the animal's back. And the research has shown in all cattle types that that is a very poor indicator of actual muscularity in carcass. It's actually a much better indicator to look at the animal and to size up the hindquarter and the forequarter, or the round muscling and the chuck muscling on those cattle. So the industry's adapting to systems that can assess not just a one-dimensional surface area of the ribeye, but also the holistic three-dimensional muscling of the animal. So when it gets right down to it, three-dimensional imaging or three-dimensional scanning of either live animals or carcass gives us a lot better picture of what conformation and muscularity looks like. The most advanced technologies that we're using in exploration today are X-ray technologies. So CT scanning is the primary technology that we're looking at in carcasses. So the idea that we can take a carcass and push it through a CT scanner and not only have that three-dimensional measurement on the outside of the carcass, but we can actually look into the carcass and truly quantify muscle, fat, and bone. So that's where we're headed, a very granular, almost milk component-based discussion, right? Where we have muscle or protein, fat, and then bone that goes into that pricing mechanism at some point in the future.
And that was going to be my next question. Does that help the pricing mechanism that, for the beef?
It makes it more accurate. And I think what our industry is lacking is a very accurate and clear market signal that takes us in the right direction. As I mentioned before, we use weight, and weight has taken us down a road of cattle being too fat. And so as a result of that, we're producing more waste product. That waste product today has some value in the biofuel market, but when you take a look at the math of feeding corn to cattle to make fat for biofuel, that's probably the most inefficient process on the planet. So we'd be a lot better off taking corn, for example, and making corn ethanol out of it than we would feeding it through a ruminant system. So ultimately, this improvement in measuring red meat yield will send a clearer signal back to those producing the cattle, and specifically the feedlot phase, and help them to manage to a more responsible, more accurate, more sustainable, if you will, endpoint. And then the payment mechanism, right, from the packer back to that production system will be truly based on something they can rely on, something that's going to give them ROI, because when they pay X for carcass, they know they're going to get Y out. Right now, it's, the yield grade equation that we're using currently is so inaccurate that they're playing the averages.
Sure.
But on an individual animal basis, there's really not much accuracy at all. I think the biggest takeaway, and the dairy men and women are the very best at this, but genomics, right? So if you know what a cow is going to produce in the lactation sense, then you can elevate her to the top of your herd. You know that she's the highest performer, the highest producer. We can keep her in the herd, we can breed her back, we can keep her daughters in our system. And that's exactly what this type of information can and will do on the terminal side of the business, it's once we understand which sires in particular, so the beef side of the equation, are producing the superior animals, and we have really consistent and accurate data on the measurement side of things, on the X-ray side of things or 3D side of things, then we can aggressively put pressure on those genetics and really, really improve those genetics with good information. And I think that's what we're the most excited about is providing accurate feedback to make genetic progress, to make these animals as good as, and I think if you've heard my talk, maybe even better than conventional beef in a lot of ways. Okay. And then we don't have to worry about when the beef cattle herd returns. These cattle will be extremely valuable regardless of, what the supply and demand looks like.
Sure. So. Might be an unfair question, but if you had your crystal ball, when would you say timeline-wise that the industry will kind of make this shift to, really utilizing the technology, being more specific around the pricing?
I would just say that the industry, the beef industry, the packing industry, is very eager to make this happen. Sure. Of course, timelines are always dependent upon circumstance, but crystal ball, we're moving forward in the next calendar year with development and establishing, for example, CT scanning and three-dimensional scanning as in test or proof of concept studies. I think we're 3 to 5 years,
Okay.
And I think we're 3 years from understanding if technology or understanding that technology does work, and then probably another year or two to implement those, sure, in the system and let them start passing data back into the upstream systems. Here's the critical piece. So we're sitting here today talking about how this is going to change and how we might value cattle differently in 3 years. Well, the animals that are going to be born or fed and finished in 3 years need to be bred today,
sure,
right? So we're really kind of going at it blind at this point, but I will tell you that in our space and the word's out that we in our research program are working on these technologies. The genetics providers on the beef side are already working with us, communicating with us, wanting to know what types of sires do we need to be selecting, what types of things do we need to be measuring from these sires. So probably more than any time in our past, we're going to be prepared, at least well on our way in the genetic side of things now in advance of a technology like this coming forward.
So from the dairy standpoint, okay, with everything you guys are learning and have shared so far, what changes are they potentially looking at making to their beef on, dairy programs that they're working with today?
Yeah, changes are largely due to management. Management has been very scrutinized in the calf stages of beef on dairy calf production. A lot of that is finger pointing back and forth in our industry as to who's causing these liver abscesses,
Sure.
And that's really the big question. And disappointingly, I don't think anybody has the right answer at this point as to, the root cause or the predominant cause. Certainly calf management, calf health is a big, big possibility there and likely possibility.
Sure.
But it continues on into the feedlot phases. And the truth is if at any point in the lifespan of that animal, if they become compromised, they can or will develop liver abscess. But I do think there's been a tremendous amount of improvement and focus on calf management. And I'm talking about colostrum, I'm talking about just nutrition in general. How much should they be getting in the way of milk or bottles? Mm-hmm. How much should they be getting or how early should they be getting feed or concentrate in the pen? What level of roughage or forage should be in that? And there's been a whole lot of experimenting, large and small operations with a variety of protocols. There's been a lot of investment, pharmaceutical companies and nutrition companies, feed providers, milk providers, dumping dollars, large dollars into understanding this issue. I think in general it's improved. We've seen a decline in the number of liver abscesses. However, it's not across the board. And when these cattle come into a processing plant, the processing plant is still having to shuffle because of liver abscess issues. So we may very well have gone from a 60% incidence rate to maybe in the 40s, or in some cases on average in the 30s. The reality is, and that's percentage of liver abscesses within a group. In some cases, it's much lower than that. And that's what the processor or packer has really grown interested in. There may be a feedlot here or there, a calf source here or there that all of a sudden has 10%, which is well within the reasonable average of fed cattle across the country. So there have been some that have been recognized by the packer, by the industry, as doing an exceptional job. And so that goes into the questions, well, what are they doing different? And so there's a lot of that discussion still going on. In many ways, that's become a competitive advantage, right, for those that are doing it very well. But the trade secrets aren't necessarily being shared. So it comes back onto research and kind of guessing at what they're doing, or making observations as to what they're doing, and maybe trying to put that into a research trial somewhere else. But I think there's a lot of ways to get to the finish line in a successful manner. But we just have to keep the calves healthy. We have to be responsible in feeding them. But the biggest evolutions that have occurred and that will continue to have to occur are in that calf management and cattle feeding space.
Okay.
We're dealing with a digestive issue here,
Sure.
with liver abscess. So until we figure out how to keep the stomach, the digestive tract of these animals intact, we'll continue to have these issues.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's very insightful. I was not aware of some of those major challenges that are presented there.
Hey everyone, this is Paul Dyke with GPS Dairy Consulting. Wanted to let you know that we've got feeder meetings coming up here in March 18th through the 21st. Check out our website to get an idea of where the locations are. There's some around Greenleaf, Madison, Fond du Lac. There'll be a site for you. Hey, this year's going to be really fun. Again, we're going to work with the feeders. It's our one time of the year where we really spend a lot of time with the feeders in a group. It's my favorite meeting of the year. I love having all the feeders, 20 to 25 feeders in a room, to really talk about things that are important to them. We start off with world-class feeding goals, always interesting discussion. I love talking as a group about how we do dry matters, how we face bunkers. What do we do when it snows or when it rains? We really like to talk about how do we handle refusals, or what's our different objectives in terms of targets. So I love doing that. We're going to have some discussion on basic rumen function, clean feed, those kind of topics as always. So food will be provided. Talk to your local GPS consultant and they'll give you a few more details. Again, coming up here in March, if you get a question, please give me a call or talk to your consultant.
Dr. Woerner, when you were talking about calf nutrition and its effect of liver abscesses, what have you really pinpointed around the root cause of the liver abscess as it pertains to the calf nutrition aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. As we've talked and debated and discussed over time, we have yet to be able to put a pinpoint finger on any one causative, or at least any one factor that's causing all of the liver abscesses. One thing to remember is that the liver abscess is a secondary health event, right? So the liver abscess doesn't just show up as a first problem. The liver abscess shows up as a result of an insult either to the rumen or the intestinal hindgut of the animal, and so that provides an avenue in the way of a lesion in the rumen or a lesion in the hindgut to get that pathogenic bacteria, Fusobacterium, Mecophorum, and potentially some other species to get into the liver and cause that infection. How does it get there? That's your question. Dietary insult is the most obvious answer. Does the animal go off feed and then return back to feed and overeat, become acidotic? That happens in the rumen as well as the hindgut. We lose this barrier or defense mechanism that the animals naturally have to keep their intestinal lining, their rumen linings intact. what causes that compromise. And I think it really comes down to, and we're getting more and more evidence tied to the fact that, are these animals healthy, right? What is causing them to go off feed? What is causing them to have this sporadic eating behavior and become acidotic? And in my opinion, and through our work, there's more and more evidence building for the animal's ability to fight infection, okay? Animals are going to encounter respiratory pathogens. Animals are commingled, they're going to find a way to get sick. It's no different than kids in kindergarten or adults on an airplane. So really building that immunity and keeping animals healthy, whether it's respiratory or scours or both, what do we need to do to allow that animal to prevent that from occurring? Secondarily, if they do become ill, help them to fight off that infection or that disease state, because the animal has a really difficult time fighting two infections at one time. And so this is kind of the reality that I've come to. We have a lot of data, blood data, that shows that when the animal has a liver abscess, there are less antibodies, less white blood cells in the circulatory system to fight infection. So that immune response has aggregated itself, has localized to that liver abscess, okay, which means that it's subtracted immune capacity out of the animal's system. You put it in reverse. Let's say the animal had pneumonia. It's recruited all of its immune response to fight this pneumonia, which has opened up susceptibility to an infection in the liver. So this goes both directions, but dare I say that more likely we're dealing with scours or respiratory issue first, which causes the gut to open up. It allows for that bacterial pathogen to get to the liver, and then the immune system's smoked, right? It's already out here fighting a battle or two. There's just not enough capacity for it to come in and fight a second or third infection. Then, once the animal has liver abscess, it makes it even more difficult for it to recover from the pneumonia. And if it's harboring liver abscess throughout the lifespan of the animal, they can last weeks, they can last months, they can last lifetime. Then we're subtracting again immune system from that animal to then again be compromised. So we get into these kind of chronic scenarios where we're just overtaxing the immunity of the animal. So how do we build immunity? I mean, there's probably the most common theme in calf management is colostrum, right? And colostrum isn't the only answer to build immunity, but it's probably the most obvious, right, in this discussion. Here's another concept too. Animal becomes ill, probably respiratory, maybe scours. First thing we're going to do is hit them with a pretty heavy antimicrobial drug to help them get over that infection. Well, we're dealing with ruminant animals, so what are we doing? If they're at a stage where their rumen is developed or partially developed, we're killing those bacteria in their gut. So by treating them for disease, respiratory with heavy doses of antibiotics, simultaneously killing off their natural flora in their rumen, we're making them even more susceptible for liver abscess. So this becomes kind of a domino or a cascading effect, in my opinion, that we're just creating part of these problems as a result of the animal getting sick. So long and short, we've got to keep the animal healthy. And it really just comes down to health. Our data are overwhelmingly demonstrative of the fact that when an animal has a liver abscess, in the feeding phase, so in the feedlot phase, when these animals are reaching full-grown maturity, they're the most inefficient animals in the entire feedlot. Makes sense. The liver is the primary metabolic organ. So without the liver functioning at full capacity, we're not going to be feed efficient. We're not going to convert or utilize energy appropriately with that animal. So there's a huge detriment. We talked about trimming livers and trimming carcasses as a value loss, but the truth be told, there's additive, maybe even more value loss in the inefficiencies that they create in the feeding process. And the number one detractor from value to the producer for a liver abscess is a lighter carcass weight. So we have very clear evidence that shows that animals with extreme liver abscess, the A+ liver abscesses that cause all of the problems, those animals hang lighter carcasses. And so those carcasses are going to be less valuable, and to the tune of $100 or more back to the producer. So it's a costly exercise, and we all have to be invested in solving this problem for all of these reasons. There's animal health concerns, there's efficiency concerns, and then of course there's economics involved.
Yeah, thank you for the great explanation on that. One thing that kind of spurred a thought when you were talking about it, I guess, from the plant, the processor standpoint, why are the liver abscesses such a challenge for them? Can you talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. The most obvious thing is the liver is not saleable.
Sure.
Right? It's an inedible product. It's removed from the rest of the product of the animal. It's condemned, goes into a rendering scenario. So we go from maybe a $7 or $8 value per animal down to a penny's value. So
Okay.
we get an immediate hit in a dollars and cents standpoint there. However, that's probably the least of the worries. Packers have gotten to the point where it's like, well, they're willing to sacrifice a $5 to $8 liver. The bigger issues are when it becomes extreme or severe, then those abscesses can actually adhere themselves to other parts of the carcass, like the diaphragm muscle, which is used to make fajitas today. Very, very valuable cut. That diaphragm is valued very close to, and in some scenarios, higher than tenderloin, filet mignon in beef. So that's a very valuable issue in the sense that when that liver abscess does attach, or really even just come into contact and contaminate that muscle, it's removed, right? So it's a loss in that sense. Liver abscesses that are severe can adhere not only to the muscle portion of the carcass, but to all of the other components of the internal viscera, or the guts, if you will. And so as a result, we get this cascading of products that have to be thrown out. And so there's more value there. That can sum up to a couple of $100 an animal. But here's the biggest thing. The biggest thing is that these plants are very expensive to operate. And so anytime you have a couple thousand employees at a facility, you're paying that overhead in the way of salary and hourly wages at all times. The worst thing that can happen in that plant, other than some personal injury, of course, would be for the production to stop. So when that production stops, that is the most costly event in that facility. So it can literally cost a couple of $1,000s, if not more, a minute for that facility to stop. So here's the scenario. Let's say we have 100 crossbred calves coming through the facility as a group. And of those 100, let's say 45 out of the 100, 45% of them have a liver abscess. And so we're dealing with removing livers, we're dealing with, condemning those pieces. But then let's say that 20% of those, so 20 out of the 100 are so severe that they require additional trimming to that carcass. Well, these plants were designed to accommodate that trimming, but they're only designed to accommodate that trimming maybe for 10 or 15 head at a time. And so what happens is they'll fill up this side rail that we call it, where the cattle come out to be trimmed. Well, once it's full and the next animal comes down the line that has to be put onto that rail, the whole plant calls a timeout and it stops. And so then it becomes a frantic movement and exercise to trim them as fast as they can, get them back into the production stream so they can start the line back up. But let's say the capacity of that out rail is 15, I've got 20. 5 head take a long time to trim to the satisfactory level of the USDA, right, who's responsible for making sure food is safe. So thousands upon thousands of dollars in downtime and inefficiencies there. This was an early learning for the packers. They would just, like the rest of the cattle that come in groups of 100 or 200 or 300, they would just line them up and run them through the facility. And then they learned really quickly wow, we can't do that.
Sure.
And so even today, as a precaution and as a reality, they'll pulse these crossbreds in 30, 40, 50 at a time, whatever their going incidence rate is and what compared to what the capacity of their outspace is, and they'll put them in at that number. And for us as researchers who routinely go in and collect data on these cattle, we may have 150 head of crossbred calves that are going to be harvested in the plant that day that we're trying to catch liver scores and lung scores and carcass data on. You know, once upon a time, 100 head took 20 minutes to run in the plant. Now they're going to fraction them out, and we're going to spend all day there. So for us, it's turned a 1 hour exercise into 8 hours, just waiting for these cattle to run through the facility because they're just going to pulse them through little by little through that process. So that's the real issue there. Of course, beef is extremely high, so those product losses are meaningful as well.
They're significant right now.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess as we look to wrap up the discussion today, we talked about some of the major challenges that your team's been working on. What are you guys finding as kind of the major highlights of the work you've been doing and things that will kind of carry the momentum of beef on dairy into the future here beyond 5-10 years?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of progress made. I mean, from the early days of the mass change to beef on dairy, 7-8 years ago, if it's been that long, the cattle have improved drastically, and that's been really exciting to see. Most of those improvements have been in that conformation of cattle. Sure. They've become more beef-like, if you will, in their carcass conformations. As a researcher, the problems that we've talked about today, that the beef on dairy industry has kind of posed in large numbers, were problems that our native beef cattle industry had or has as well. Even though maybe they were less pronounced, like the liver abscess issue occurred at 20-25% of the native beef population. It wasn't until we saw these cattle double that or more did we really pay close attention to it. So this sector of our industry has allowed for us to focus on issues that we needed to fix. And so these issues that we're fixing, both liver abscesses and red meat yield discussions, will better the entire industry. But they were really brought to light with this new population of cattle that make up almost a quarter of the mix today. There's a lot more to talk about in the way of carbon credit and sustainability discussions. These calves show more potential and more promise than any other type of cattle coming through our system to be branded or labeled with carbon credit claims. They're coming in as a quote-unquote byproduct of the dairy industry. Sure. Right, wrong, or indifferent, the carbon of producing that calf has been allocated to the dairy industry. So that calf comes in at day one with zero carbon tied to it, unlike the beef calf, who has a tremendous amount of carbon tied to it because that's its sole purpose, is to become a beef calf. So the idea that we have a carbon neutral calf at the start of this feeding phase coming in, we're adding carbon credit to it, you know, in the sense that it's utilizing carbon in the feeding process, is there, but the beef calf will never catch up to it in terms of the lack of carbon tied to that calf. So there are plenty of retailers, plenty of customers of beef out there very interested in these calves for that carbon credit. And I think, and this is purely my opinion, but when the beef cattle numbers return, it's going to put pressure on these calves in the way of price, right? They're going to have to compete more competitively with the larger numbers in the population. But this will remain an advantage for them. And so despite whatever issues we may still have at that point, including liver abscesses or maybe even some yield issues, no one else is going to have that carbon credit hanging on them the way that these dairy calves do. If carbon credits continue to be as valuable as they currently are, then that will be something that keeps these cattle not only in the market, but at a high value. And one of the common misperceptions too, as I make that comment, you know, there's some naivety by beef producers early on thinking that somehow these cattle were replacing their cattle. It's like, no. These cattle are replacing the Holsteins that we once had.
Yep.
So we didn't come in and add 20% to the beef cattle supply. We wish that we did. We need that 20%, but we didn't. We just exchanged them for really an inferior beef animal in the way of the Holstein, and we've improved that a great deal. So these cattle, everyone should know, are not additive to our market. They're just different, and in so many ways, better. And so it's been a positive story from day one, and it will continue to be a positive story. I actually had somebody in the elevator attending this conference last night say, well, do you think we'll keep producing these things? And I said, well, God, I hope so. They're not going to go away.
Yeah.
And I dread the day where we even think or consider that we might go back to just producing purebred Holstein steers in this market, because they've been such a drastic improvement. They've added so much value back to the dairyman and also the industry as a whole. We can't go back, right? These are the cattle that we need from the dairy industry. I would dare to say we'll always have them, and I think they'll continue to get better over time.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for being with us, and thank you and your team for all the work that you're doing as an industry. We really appreciate it to learn alongside of you guys and get better as the years go on. So thank you.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks.
You just heard from GPS team member Jordan Hunt and Dr. Dale Woerner from Texas Tech here on the GPS DairyCast. I'm your host, Peggy Coffeen from the Uplevel Dairy Podcast, and thanks for listening to the GPS DairyCast.
The GPS DairyCast features conversations that deliver on the GPS Dairy Consulting promise to inspire change and grow leaders. If this GPS DairyCast has you looking for more ways to become an elite dairy producer, find more information in our show notes on how you can add a GPS advisor to your team.